Thank you so much, and we really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. As you said, I am Sujata, and I'm involved with Cure VCP disease. We can move on to the next slide from there. So VCP disease is an ultra-rare adult onset degenerative neuromuscular disease. It can present with inclusion body myopathy, Paget's disease of the bone, or frontal temporal dementia. And it can be 1, 2, 3, all three of them, or it can be any combination of those phenotypes. And so for us, there are several repurposing opportunities that are, kind of on the horizon. And we wanted to meet those opportunities once they come available with preparedness. And so one of our issues is that there is no quantitative data for the rate of muscle degeneration. And there's also a lack of funding for establishing those measures and even for establishing centers of excellence. And, with COVID, it kind of halted some of those NIH funding submissions. And because of that, it would kind of put our researchers a couple of years behind, even the ones that had intended to apply for funding. So this past April, we had a patient conference that was scheduled, and we were going to have Lindsay, Alfano from Nationwide Children's Hospital, come and kick off a natural history study. But of course, COVID came and it kind of stopped us for a minute. So, we kind of regrouped and pivoted and figured we needed a faster and simpler way to conduct these natural history studies. And we also needed it to be a little bit less expensive because, funding is an issue at this point. The next slide, please. So our strategy was really to think outside the box, and we wanted to be innovative and use COVID as an opportunity instead of as a brick wall. So we had been talking with Lindsay Alfano again at Lowe's Lab, and they had already been conducting remote assessments for neuromuscular diseases. So we started working with them and just kind of defining and choosing measures that were specific for VCP disease that we could possibly do remotely. And just to kind of give a timeline, we started talking about the remote measures and the possibility of doing this at the end of June. And then by September 9th, Lindsay was already assessing our first patient. So we came up with a protocol. The feasibility study was phase 1, and this is where we wanted to see if we could capture data safely and accurately using a remote platform. So I think we used Zoom. And then Cure VCP Disease, our patient advocacy organization, provided all the kits that each of the patients would need at home. So that was very standard. Everybody received the same equipment in these kits. So phase 2 is where we are now, and we're still kind of defining the specifics of a protocol. We have a good start to it, but this is really to define the natural history of our disease. And then the second objective is to validate that the in-person measures are consistent with the remote measures. So as we were creating, next slide, please. As we were creating the protocol, we wanted to make sure that we were doing things in a way that would sit well with the FDA. And so we did have an informal meeting with the FDA. And the 3 things that they stressed were, 1, they really wanted to make sure that we were doing, everything was very standardized testing and the equipment. Of course, safety of patients was of the utmost importance. And then they wanted us to be able to measure some sort of meaningful change. As far as additional guidance that we'd be interested in is, at the beginning of COVID, everything was so new. And so we really felt it was important to validate that the in-person testing was equal to the remote testing. And I'm wondering, as things have evolved, is that necessary? Is it necessary to validate, both of those things? Because even aside from COVID, it's a significant burden for our patients to travel to go to these in-person visits. Now, Lindsay Alfano is going to talk about the successes and challenges and everything else. So you could, next slide, please, for Lindsay.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sujata, and thanks for inviting us to speak. I think this is a really exciting topic. And kind of thinking about the successes and challenges, I think the first success is that we're even talking about doing remote measures. I know this was a huge hurdle to overcome prior to this, where we had talked about it, but no efforts were underway. So the fact that we're this far along is, I think, a huge success. So data, I think, is what I've got as kind of our first sign of success. So data means that we're accessing patients in this time where no one's going anywhere, which is huge. I think the internet quality, which I've got in this kind of challenges section, is one of those hurdles that made us a bit resistant to reach out to patients virtually. So the fact that we're capturing data, trials are able to move along, tells us that we can be more successful than we kind of worried we would be prior to all of this. So as Sujata was saying, we have kind of several efforts underway, but we've been trying to kind of incorporate all of the learnings that we're getting across patient populations to try to move things forward for each patient population without having to recreate the wheel for everyone. So like Sujata said, we've been able to establish some initial feasibility of doing a variety of outcome measures remotely. We are evaluating the consistency. Knowing the scientific field, no one just believes us if we say what we do in the home is the same as what we do in the clinic, as many of you here know. And so we're finding ways to validate that consistency of remote visits versus on-site visits, trying to minimize the amount of on-site visits, because really what we want to know is what we can do remotely. But having enough data points that we are establishing some of that consistency so that moving forward, we can have more of that hybrid, or even as was mentioned in the other session, a fully virtual clinical trial, which would be great. And then also, excuse me, understanding some of the reliability of these measures, and if there's any difference in reliability in the remote session versus the clinical session. I think, hypothetically, we think it could go one way or the other, but really having that data is going to support our decisions moving forward. What I think has been really exciting is the amount of buy-in and enthusiasm and collaboration that has been ongoing in this period of time between, academic medical centers, research institutions, patient advocacy groups, governmental bodies and regulators and payers, and all of that has really allowed us to be quickly successful and more flexible and innovative. The CARE VCP group in particular, I think, has really helped move our initial phase project forward by, as Sujata said, providing all of the equipment to families, helping to kind of coordinate some of these early visits to help patients understand what to expect and have that communication from a patient perspective. We at the hospital do that as well, but I think there's a different level of buy-in if you're hearing it from patients versus kind of being told that from the clinic. And we've been able to access patients that we wouldn't necessarily be able to see in ultra rare diseases, especially. I think trying to get a large cohort of patients involved in the natural history trial can be really challenging. And that speaks to the cost of natural history trials when you've got patients traveling hours, flights across multiple states. The cost to try to support patients to participate can just add up exponentially, not to mention the loss of work time and impact to the family dynamic in that way. There were some initial concerns and challenges, which I think I've listed kind of our top ones here, but I think we found ways to kind of mitigate or control most of these issues, which is also, we'll put our concerns and challenges into that success category as well. I think patient safety was our initial main concern. Worst case scenarios, we're asking patients to do these challenging walking tests or balance tests, and someone would get hurt. That would really halt the effort. So, we've put measures in place to ensure that patients have a caregiver or family member or someone available in the home from a safety perspective, just to be there, which I think to date, knock on wood, we've had no falls or injuries. Our remote assessments have been as safe as they would be in the clinic. I think internet quality, and not everyone is a videographer by nature. Some of those things were a bit challenging to start. We have found ways to manage some of the internet quality by reducing some of the video streaming that's been going on during the assessments for some of the families. Everybody's been incredibly patient. So if we do have some temporary buffering issues, we've been able to wait until we get a better signal to let the testing continue. And everyone has also been really great at letting us boss them around and using tripods and saying, hey, don't, run with your husband or caregiver or child. Stay in one place so that we can see what we need to see. Space constraints within the home, I think, is something that is hard to overcome because your home is your home. But luckily, a lot of the assessments that we do clinically don't require a large amount of space. Some of the longer walking tests and things like that, we don't have long walking tracks, but we're still able to get useful information that's meaningful from a clinical and clinical trial perspective. There have been a lot of fun variables in the home environment that we don't often encounter in the clinic, like dogs and cats and other siblings and things. But again, we've been able to kind of mitigate some of those things. And having the family involved is also really nice. So, letting brothers and sisters participate in some of the testing has added another layer of kind of excitement for some of the children and adults that we have been participating. Timed testing was a huge concern to start with. We were noticing a lot of challenges with buffering and the internet at different locations, and we've been able to come up with strategies to make this as reliable as we're seeing in the clinic. So that's been really key. Next slide. So thinking about how we can use what we're learning to kind of inform future practice, I think we were all a bit reactive. Speaking from the academic research institution, we definitely reacted to this pandemic, but I think we see that once COVID goes away, or we've got this vaccination that reduces risk and we're all kind of back to the new normal, there are opportunities to be a little bit more proactive to try to reduce the burden of clinical research trial participation to make sure that patients are coming to us when they need to come to us, and maybe we can gather a lot more data remotely. I think, we always talk about the travel burden, the costs associated with clinical trial participation. And I think we can get a much more diverse cohort if we do have that remote testing implemented within a clinical trial. There may be a hybrid structure where some visits are remote, or we do think that a lot of the clinical outcomes that a PT would perform can be done fully remotely for some trials. Now, we can't necessarily do muscle biopsies or other things like that people have mentioned previously, but some of these items can be done remotely. Thinking about policy considerations. So we heard in the earlier session about kind of waivers for doctors to see patients across state lines from a clinical perspective to reduce some of that loss of access to care. That same waiver didn't necessarily make it to other healthcare professionals. So physical therapy, for example, we see a lot of patients from out of state that we weren't able to see clinically because of licensure issues across state lines. And so thinking about rare diseases and ultra rare diseases, I think this really does impact access to care. So hoping that, as we continue to see some of these waivers continue, maybe they can also broaden and expand, because we are able to see these patients safely across state lines. We are able to see patients for research applications, but that difference in access to care can be a little bit frustrating from the hospital PT perspective. And we are really, as I've kind of alluded to, really hoping that moving forward, we'll have this continued acceptance of remote and virtual methods of assessment, and not have, these methods and access to patients cut off when we are all back to our new normal. So all in all, I think our efforts have been really successful. And like I said, with this collaboration, we've been able to move things forward much more quickly than kind of our standard practice, which has been great.